Joining me now is Corey Diaz, the CEO of Anfield Energy. Great to see you again, Corey.
Good to see you, Mark.
Now, for those who may not be familiar, we don't want to leave them behind. So let's get up to speed again and remind everybody about Anfield's strategy of advancing uranium and vanadium assets in the United States, a hub and spoke model, with the hub being the Shootaring Canyon mill in Utah.
Yeah, so investors can look at Anfield as a hub and spoke story. So the hub, as you mentioned, is the Shootaring Canyon mill. The spokes are represented by the Velvet Wood mine, the Slick Rock mine, the Westlow properties that we hold. So essentially, we're like a bicycle wheel with the hub in the middle, represented by Shootaring, and the spokes represented by our mines.
Corey, you said you'd like to submit the reactivation plan for the mill to regulators early this year, and that if approved, you'd go from standby to operational. So are you confident that's going to happen? And what would that look like ultimately?
Sure. So the timeline to get the application into the state is probably about 30 to 60 days. And so the application that's going in for restart, as we already have a license in place. So that's the critical piece. We're just updating that license from its current standby status to operational. And that's just more of a box checking exercise for the state to understand, do we have all the pieces in place to deal with the emissions that will be, emitted by the progress and the work being done at the mill and the ultimate production at the mill. So, in terms of that part, that should be fairly straightforward. We expect about a 12-month review period for the mill license. One of the things about the license, with the submittal, is that we're actually increasing the size of the throughput of the mill. So it's a current 750 tons per day mill. We're actually increasing that to 1,000 tons per day. And we're also looking at increasing the license capacity at the mill from 1 million pounds per year to 3 million pounds per year. So those are changes that the state has to review and understand the resulting emissions related to those changes, and ultimately, allow us to move forward with operations.
Now, tying into that, you've been active as usual. You've picked up 12 more leases in Colorado from the Department of Energy. I believe you've got 21 of 31 of those leases in that state. So explain how that ties in with the increased capacity expectation at the mill.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's very important. So when we put out our PEA earlier in 2023, we had Shootaring as the hub, and we used the spokes of Velvet Wood and Slick Rock. The capacity of 750 tons per day is essentially used up by those two properties. With the increase of the throughput to 1,000 tons per day, we can essentially add another mine. So, to that end, we looked at the properties available to us, and we decided that it made sense to acquire more properties in Colorado alongside the properties that we're working with already. For example, West Slope is actually 9 DOE leases. So these additional 12 allow us to sift through those 21 leases to determine which ones are the most prospective and ultimately use those as feed for the mill, in addition to Slick Rock and Velvet Wood. So we can certainly pick from one of those properties or two of those properties to meet that additional 250 tons per day of throughput at the mill.
Now, Corey, a couple of things that you're waiting on and investors are waiting on are drilling permits for Velvet Wood and Slick Rock. Again, timelines there. What are the expectations?
So we did submit an application to the BLM for a small drill program, 20-hole drill program, in November of last year. We expect to get approval for that and start work in the spring at Slick Rock. We'll do something similar at Velvet Wood later this year. The ultimate aim is to have both of these properties available and ready for production in about 18 months from now. And that will allow us to start stockpiling material in anticipation of the mill restart in about 24 months. So, both of these mines were advancing for that purpose. If we decide to add more properties to the mix, we'll certainly move forward in the same fashion, putting together a drill program at those sites with the ultimate aim to be ready for production roughly 6 months ahead of the mill being restarted.
It's really interesting to watch Anfield continue to move towards these goals as things get closer to production. Now, something else is that you're expecting to come out with a preliminary economic assessment on West Slope sometime in 24. When do you think that might be?
Well, look, I think we're, with the acquisition of these 12 additional leases, I think our aim is going to be, pooling those assets. As I mentioned, West Slope consists of 9 DOE leases, in addition to the 12 DOE leases we've recently picked up. Our aim would be to create some kind of economies of scale amongst a pool of those assets that we would then incorporate into an updated PEA. Obviously, the PEA that we put out last year, the price of uranium in that PEA was about $70 a pound. Given where the market is today, we'll certainly see improved economics strictly on the assets that were there already. But given the expanded capacity at the mill that we're aiming for, adding 1 or 2 properties, from amongst those 21, will certainly see the economics improve even further. So West Slope as a whole, we may not put all the properties into the advanced PEA, but certainly we may look to incorporate some there and some from the newly acquired assets to create an even more robust PEA.
Also on the acquisition front, you've branched into New Mexico by buying the Marquez Juan Tafoya project. You say this instantly becomes your largest asset and a potential secondary pipeline. So can you explain the thinking behind that deal?
Sure. So, from our perspective, when you're running, a producing company, a uranium producing company, you want to have feed that continually can be fed through the mill, and you don't want to deplete the assets you have. We don't want to have a finite number of pounds sitting on our books. So, once we've used 1 pound, that pound's lost forever. So the idea here is to create a pipeline that could last, 20 to 25 years or longer. So as we deplete, we replace. And so, Marquez Juan Tafoya, the largest single uranium asset within our portfolio with about 18 million pounds of resource, certainly helps us go a long way to having sustainable long-term production. And so one of the reasons we looked at that asset, first of all, it's our first foray into New Mexico, new market for us, which could potentially open up, a few more doors and opportunities within that market. But secondly, that's an asset that will take a little bit longer for us to develop. It's obviously a longer distance to get to the mill. There's some work that can be done there in order for us to upgrade prior to shipping, but that's work that will take a little bit of time. So given that it's not our primary asset, we have the time to go through and deliberately understand the path to production using that asset. But it also links with the other secondary assets, as we call it. Our primary assets are in Utah and Colorado, but the secondary assets in New Mexico and Arizona, this serves as kind of the anchor asset, for that secondary production pipeline. And so we think it's an important step for us to get a better understanding of New Mexico, how it operates, what the challenges are, the further opportunities within that market, but certainly how it does dovetail and complement the assets we have in Arizona as kind of part of our long-term strategy.
Broadly in the sector, Corey, Kazatomprom, which produces about 40% of the world's uranium supply out of Kazakhstan, recently warned about production because of a lack of sulfuric acid. So how does that story tie in with the geopolitical risk in the sector, which we've seen in Niger, for example, with the coup there several months ago, and that's still unresolved for a lot of companies, but also highlight the safety of the jurisdictions in which you operate and Anfield operates in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think, the one thing about the sector, the very interesting thing about the sector is that, there are geopolitical risks associated with a number of places where you find most of the uranium. Obviously the U.S. and Canada are a little bit different, but certainly places like Uzbekistan, Niger, as you mentioned, Kazakhstan, a lot of those places produce a lot of uranium, but don't necessarily use it. So it's shipped out to other places that don't have significant production. And so there's always a risk. And we saw that risk, starting to take shape, or at least be highlighted, through COVID, the breakdown of supply chains going from east to west. And obviously you've got the risk of war, Ukraine and Russia, which is once again disrupted supply chain. So, there's a lot of geopolitical risk in the marketplace, which once again highlights the value of having assets within safe jurisdictions, whether it's Cameco or US based players. Certainly, I think from our perspective, and you can see the US government has obviously cottoned on to the same concept that, it's critical to have access to this material, but there's always a concern about the breakdown of geopolitical risk, even within conversion and enrichment. Russia, is a pariah in the market right now, and the U.S. is passing legislation to prohibit or slow down the amount of material flowing from Russia from the conversion and enrichment perspective into the U.S. I don't think that things happen in a vacuum. So, even as legislation is passed, with a timeline attached to it of a few years, certainly that doesn't compel the Russians to comply. The Russians can turn around and stop delivery of material to the West, which would have an even bigger impact on U.S. utilities or Western utilities. So I think it's very important to understand that the U.S. government is starting to recognize this risk and therefore is encouraging conversion and enrichment to be built domestically. And certainly the production side of uranium is a big part of the mix, because obviously without the uranium you can't move to conversion or enrichment. So I think it highlights the value of being in a very, very safe jurisdiction with the largest install base of reactors in the world at the moment. So we have buyers of our material, which I think is a significant part of our calculus here.
Lastly, Corey, the uranium sector has been red hot, as you know, with prices at the highest levels in years for uranium, over $100 a pound, in part because of the geopolitical risks you're talking about and the lack of supply and the supply-demand scenario. Anfield stock has gotten a lift the last while, as have a lot of uranium-related plays. But I'm guessing you probably still think you're undervalued compared to some peers, especially those that you highlight in your slide deck, in your corporate presentation, that don't even have a mill, whereas you do. And some of those companies have higher market caps than you. So where do you stand in terms of how the market is perceiving the Anfield story?
Well, look, I don't think we're probably as well known as many of those companies in the slide, the peer comparison slide that you're mentioning. But I also think that there's probably some, viewed as some kind of financing risk related to the restart of the mill. The mill itself is going to cost, $65 to $70 million, including, the refurbishment of the mill, the redoing of the tailings pond, and the building out of a vanadium circuit, because the mines that we have in Colorado are essentially vanadium mines as opposed to uranium mines. So, certainly there's probably some risk being added into our valuation. That said, we do have a pipeline of funding opportunities, especially given where the uranium price is today, that should take some of the risk off the table. So I think the first thing is we're submitting the application to the state for restart of the mill. That is something that investors may not be aware of, and how important that is, because it actually sets a timeline for us within which we'll be up and in production. So we're calling that 24 months from the time we submit. So I think that'll probably help alleviate some of the risk related to the mill. I guess the other side is, the cost of refurbishing the mill. It's something that's going to be done over 2 years, but we certainly will be in a position to fund it. We do have funding partners available to us at the moment. We've had numerous discussions with parties, both private and public, for the funding of the mill. And so, once we demonstrate that, once we've shared that information, once we've decided on who our partners will be, I think that'll take a fair amount of the risk off and provide us with a re-rating of the stock, and therefore valuation should improve. But I think that's what's been weighing on us for the most part. But I think certainly, the valuation, we're not getting any value for the mill at the moment. And so I think that we'll see a significant turn once we've been able to, first of all, meet the milestone of submitting the application to the state.
All right. Some great insight there, Corey. Thanks for the update, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate your time.
Corey Diaz, the CEO of Anfield Energy. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll talk to you next time.